Welcome to Noon Hour Slides from the Moose Jaw Museum and Art Gallery. We're located on Treaty 4 territory, the traditional lands of the Blackfoot, Cree, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We pay our respects to First Nations and Métis ancestors and reaffirm our relationship with one another. We gratefully acknowledge funding from the City of Moose Jaw, SaskArts, SaskCulture, Saskatchewan Lotteries, Canada Council for the Arts, Canadian Heritage, and the Government of Canada. I'm Vincent Hotelling, the administrative assistant here. I'm here to welcome you to today's presentation. Karla and Chris Rasmussen are here to talk about their trip to Clear Lake and Riding Mountain National Park in Manitoba. Welcome.
Thanks very much. Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Rasmussen, and of course, my wife Karla is here with us today as well.
Howdy.
We apologize in advance. We're both on the same internet in the same house, but in different rooms. So if you see a bit of a lag, that's likely what's going on. As mentioned, the presentation today will be about Clear Lake and Riding Mountain National Park in Manitoba. For those of you not familiar with the park, if you've been to Waskesiu here in Saskatchewan, you will have a very familiar feeling with the park in Manitoba. And that's because they're actually sister parks. I have a great deal of difficulty when we go from one park to the other park. And that's because the plans for the town site and some of the campsites are actually the same. They've just been flipped. So every time I come into the park for the first time, I need to reorientate myself with just where what is so that I'm not turning down the wrong street to go somewhere. This park is just inside the Manitoba border. There are a couple of ways to get there. You can go up through, I believe it's Yorkton, correct, Karla? And then you kick to the east and you basically drive right into the park.
Melville's where you turn to go across.
Melville,
I'm going to try to bring
you.
up the map here. Just bear with me.
Sure.
See if I can do this.
The other way that you can go is just go straight over to Brandon, and then it's a straight shot to the north, and you can't really miss it unless you drive right through the park and then out the other side. So it's a great drive from Saskatchewan to go and check it out. It's between 4 and 5 hours, depending on how many stops you need to make, depending if you're hauling a trailer or not, if you're on a motorcycle, if you're in the car, there's a number of different factors, but it's between 4 and 5 hours. So
Okay,
you can see it.
Can you see the map there? Yeah.
I can see the map now. The Riding Mountain National Park is there just in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. And like I said, it's a pretty easy drive. It's not too terrible. For me, the best way is just go over to Brandon and then again straight north. So these pictures are from our trips last summer. And we were fortunate enough to get a call from one of our friends who has a cabin at the park and said, I can't get to Canada this year because of COVID. Would you folks check in on our cabin? And we had already had some trips planned for the park. And of course we said yes. The fact that she couldn't get to Canada to check on her property, of course we would step up and help her out. So that actually saved our summer because of COVID. So many travel restrictions. We had so many plans. We had to cancel trips to Poland and Vegas and so many camping trips, just like I'm sure many of you had trips planned that you had to cancel because of COVID. So being able to get to the park just inside the Manitoba border and really be to ourselves, because we didn't have to interact with anybody because we had the cabin. So that was a really, really amazing thing that really saved our summer. So we'll go through some of the photos now.
Awesome. Okay, thanks, Chris. As he mentioned, the sister park to Prince Albert National Park, Riding Mountain, was established in 1933. And if you've never been, it's kind of a boreal island. So here's a map with some of the geographical features of the park here. It's an escarpment. So when you come in from the south up this way, you really don't notice it other than maybe a line of trees along here. Partway through, you'll see we came in from the north side, and I'll point that out when we get to it. But you do actually notice the escarpment from that point of view. Like Prince Albert National Park, Riding Mountain saw a lot of relief work done during the construction phases, and I'll mention that as we go through too, and some of the similarities and maybe differences with Waskesiu. Okay, so this was our first evening. And this is in the little park in the downtown core. The town site in Riding Mountain is called Wasagaming, which means Clear Lake. And in Prince Albert, as Chris mentioned, Waskesiu, which means red deer, very similar type things. These are both kind of on the main beach. The one in Clear Lake area here has some lovely mature elms. And then this is a lovely trellis here. It's often a backdrop for weddings and special events, things like that. It's covered in grapevines and also sort of a Virginia creeper. So it turns all kinds of wonderful colors in the fall. And the thing with our pictures today as well is we were actually able to visit 4 times, and you might see a few locations repeated, such as this trellis, but you'll see them throughout the changing parts of the seasons too. This is a little restaurant slash candy store slash tchotchke shop now. This for many years was known as Scrace's Mercantile, and it was a grocery store in the park. And it still has the original oil floors. When you go inside, it still kind of has that smell. I'm sure will be nostalgic to many of our participants today here. But its most recent incarnation on the left-hand side is the Canoe Tap House. Interesting thing about this picture, this was taken about 2:30 in the afternoon. You can see how dark it is. The park had a remarkable, and actually southern Manitoba generally, remarkably wet July, and even into August. It rained almost every day during this first trip here. And while it did clear up and we got sunny breaks in between, this was a massive system that was kind of rolling in mid-afternoon. So we had decided to stop here. We got a seat under a covered area, met up with my sister, who's actually from Manitoba as well. And we had these wonderful tasty treats. The Canoe Tap House is known for serving Manitoba brewed beer. So there's lots of farmery things, Fort Garry from Winnipeg, half pints from Winnipeg, some very tasty things indeed. And we kind of got a spread of appetizers here. This is just a couple of campsites down from us the next morning. So you can kind of get an idea of some of the deluge that we encountered. And Chris and I were talking just before the presentation, and I found a story from the Brandon Sun that said in the first week of July in the Westman area, which kind of encompasses Clear Lake, there was over 200 millimeters of rain in 1 week. So it was quite incredible, and the ground was just saturated, quite honestly. It had nowhere left to go.
And this photo was taken the morning after a major system had moved through. And we actually had taken up the trailer for this trip because we had originally planned it, and being able to have access to the cottage was just a nice bonus. But I had to run back from the cottage and drive as quickly as I could to the campsite to secure things. And in a span of about 10 minutes, there was so much rain that some of the roads were flooded, trees were pushed over. Some of the trees had fallen onto sun porches. It was just an absolutely crazy storm. And you could see it coming through the trees. And I'm sure anybody who spent any time in the forest, when that big wind gust comes, you can see it because the leaves will start to shudder and you can hear it coming like a freight train. And I moved as quickly as I could to try and secure our campsite and then get back to the cottage and be able to secure it as well. But the amount of rain was just incredible in just 15 minutes.
The other thing that happened, of course, that night, it had hailed. So there's a couple pieces there. Here's some of the larger ones I picked up and brought inside to take pictures of. The outsides of quite a few of them were that really rough kind of finish there. I know that means something in meteorological terms. I can't quite remember what it is, but it was a violent storm, that's for sure. Just kind of water again. Sunny the next morning, and we hung everything out to dry. I don't think our towels actually dried the whole time we were there that week entirely, but we sure tried whenever we could. We found out by accident one of our cats actually enjoyed traveling and camping. We had a cat sitter set up for her, and she's quite geriatric. She's got some medical issues, so it was easier to bring her with us, and she really had a fun time. So she traveled with us the rest of the summer actually too. Here's Chris, and we're down at the Wishing Well. And this is something that Prince Albert National Park doesn't have, and I'm kind of partial to Manitoba. I'm from Manitoba originally. Those of you who've heard me maybe speak before, I'm from Swan River. My mom's side of the family is from Neepawa, so I'm kind of third generation holidaying here at the park. And the Wishing Well is this really neat place. It's sort of an English garden type feel, kind of the rustic wooden bridges there. This is something that has been upkept and maintained very well since the 30s. They've actually done quite an extensive outdoor renovation to it in the last few years. And I'll just maybe pause here for a second. The top picture this is me right here. and my younger sister, who's 3 years younger than me, and my parents. And we were at the wishing well, and I think this was taken in 1984. Well, I met up with my sister, as I mentioned, and we decided to try to recreate this picture. So my sister tends to pose with her mouth open when she was a small child, so we made sure that she tried to do that again there. But as you can see, things have weathered a little bit, but by and large, this part of the wishing well area, it looks kind of the same. So that was fun. We enjoyed it. Here's another example of some of the raging water. This is normally a little babbling brook that goes down through the golf course, which is just above the wishing well area, and it's kind of just totally taken things out. Moving on here, this is a postcard I found of the superintendent's residence, which is just behind the wishing well area. And here's what it looks like today. I believe this is from a slightly different angle, but it's the same building. And again, it was built during the Depression relief project. Some interesting kind of things to know about this. The cottage now is actually owned by Elkhorn Resort, which is just south of the park, but you can rent it now and actually spend some time in it. It's quite a large space. There's been some very famous guests, in addition to the superintendents of the park, who've lived there over the years. Some of these folks include Grey Owl, the naturalist, Archibald Bellany, for those of you who maybe know him by that name, who came from England. He spent a number of years in the park. He had a cottage in Riding Mountain as well as at Prince Albert National Park. He was a frequent guest here of the superintendents. There's an interesting story that might not be entirely true, but my understanding is King George VI and Queen Elizabeth were visiting the prairies in 1939, and they had stopped in Melville with the royal train. I guess one thing kind of led to the other. They had a huge crowd, a huge turnout, and it was getting late in the day, and they couldn't make it to their next destination. So there's some speculation that they actually made it to the park somehow. I'm sure that the train, I think the route, actually, there's a way you can kind of go north of Manitoba, and there's stories that they actually spent the night there kind of secretively. With it being 1939, World War II was kind of getting underway, and it was a safe place for them to spend the night before moving on to their next destination. In the 1970s, Queen Elizabeth II, Prince Philip, and Prince Charles all stayed there. There was a second bathroom actually added for the Queen's enjoyment. I think that's how it's written. It's kind of funny, but it was definitely a big place at the time, and now I think it sleeps up to 12 people quite comfortably. So kind of use that for some reference. This is downtown. This is in front of one of the very popular ice cream shops. These are my children, Isabel and Duncan, and they're enjoying the big red chair. Great photo opportunity. This is Poor Michael's Emporium, which is a landmark. It's just south of the park in a small village called Onanol, and it's been around for quite a long time. It was originally built in 1930 as the village's general store. It opened as a bookstore in 1992, and it has a number of really wonderful used items in there, picture books, novels, all kinds of things, great for rainy days at the lake. They've been very, very popular. In 2007, they actually did an extensive renovation. They added on to the back. So now there's like a little coffee bar, there's arts and crafts, there's all kinds of, there's even a performance stage on one side. It's really quite cool, and I recommend it if you're ever in the area. This is Ominik Marsh, and this is something that's also been in use as a trail system for a number of years. It's been there since I was a young girl, so at least from the early 80s. And there's the floating boardwalk that winds its way through this fabulous ecosystem. And different times of the year, the water levels are higher and lower. There's all kinds of different cattails and grasses, and my son has a fondness for leeches, and here's one that he caught with his little net.
It's an absolutely fantastic place to take the family because it's quiet, and yet you can still enjoy the birds and, like Karla said, all the little creatures that are in the water. I quite like it right at dusk as kind of the animals are coming alive, and you can really see a lot of activity here. That said, it is a popular place with bears as well, because there's quite a lot of berries along the one side. So you do have to keep that in mind as you're going through the park, because anywhere that's popular with people will often be popular with the bears as well, just because of all the plants and berries and things that are there.
And I think we'll come back here a little later in the trip. Here's some lovely sunsets. Now, if I'm not mistaken, yes. This evening, we had just gotten back to camp, and there was this huge cloud system rolling, and you can kind of just see the start of it up here at the top of the screen. And I thought to myself, oh my goodness, I bet I can get some really good pictures. You can see the wisps of rain coming down. So the kids and I hightailed it down. I think Chris was again moving stuff around, getting things secured in anticipation of another storm. And we got these really neat pictures. And it was just phenomenal to see that the sky was orange on one side and then these wonderful lavenders and purples on the other side. This is right down at lake level, as you can see, and this path I'll maybe talk about a little bit more later, goes from the town site right about here all the way around, loops around to the east, wraps all the way around the cottage development area. And it was a great vantage point for these pictures here. There's the kids again at the end of the pier, one of my favorite pictures. Oops, sorry, go back there for a moment. This picture here is taken on the North Shore, and we've done a little bit of a scenic drive. Chris's family was also along with us on this trip here, so we were kind of showing them some of the lay of the land. This is part of the Clear Lake Trail, which goes all the way around the lake. It's just over 30 kilometers, I believe, one way. I have done it in my younger years. I've done it twice. It's not an easy trek, and there's a few places where the trail's washed out and you have to walk on roads instead or even bushwhack a little bit, but this is right along the North Shore. Great time of year to go, early July. Some of the different flowers were just coming out and blooming. Red lily here, common in Saskatchewan as well. And then we're back again at the marsh, and this is a little bit later in the evening on a different day. Got some cool shadows. And then, like Chris mentioned, the wildlife, the ducks, all kinds of aquatic things to kind of peek at. You can borrow little dipper kits from the Friends of the Park office. You can pick up a net and a bucket, and they give you almost a field guide of the things you can find if you dip your net in, the different bugs and whatnot. This is the edge of Clear Lake right here. We see some folks kayaking. There's a small little spit of land here, and then I think the next photo. This looks back into a waterway, hopefully, there we go, that feeds into the marsh. So the lake and the marsh are connected through this sort of little wetlands area here. There's often beaver and muskrat activity in this area. Sometimes you can spot kits when they're quite young, playing with the parents just kind of outside of the safety zone there, and they'll call them back and give them a scolding. It's kind of fun. And this is the main pier just off of the beach. The lamppost here, I wouldn't say it's ugly, but it's definitely showing its age. I believe this is one of the originals. They've salvaged a few over the years from the beach area, and these now sit on the pier and they go all the way out. They're from the 30s, and one thing that I've always stuck out in my memory is the fish flies in July. When they emerge, they like to grab onto these, and I think that's where some of the discoloration on the stucco comes from. Here you can actually spot a few of those fish flies that are kind of making their way around. We didn't have too terrible of mosquitoes in the town site area. A few of the trails were a little bit more busy, but these ones weren't too bad. And again, just some more spectacular sunsets off of the beach. Some of the famous Parks Canada red chairs. I looked it up because I was curious, and I guess there's more than 500 sets of these red chairs in parks all across Canada. And these have been a program that they started a few years back, encourage people to take pictures and use social media to promote the parks and their usage. And they're often placed at some wonderful vantage points where you can take in the scenery. So these ones were favorites. I think we see them a few times as well. Another day, this is going out to the sort of central area of the park towards Lake Audie. This is a river normally that's quite rocky, and with all of the rains, we were quite surprised to see how high the river level was. Where is it here? This is the lake side here. And then I think if I go, there's the river side. And I'm looking for one more picture. There we go. So this one here, underneath of the bridge, there's actually a little dam. And on this trip out on this day, the riverside was nearly as high as the lakeside. So it was quite incredible to see this sort of swollen river taking over everything. We've done some fishing here in the past. I think we've caught a few pike and a few interesting other odds and ends. I think we've caught a few things, haven't we, Chris?
For sure. This is one of my favorite spots to go fishing because we have access to the structure there and the rocks that go down the other side. Normally, we really have to be careful with the lures that we use because they'll get stuck in the rocks, of course. But this trip here, the water was so high, I couldn't even tell where the rocks and the actual tributary was. All you could just see was, it looked like lake the entire way underneath. In fact, in some of the corners of the bridge, the water was up lapping against the bridge, and normally it's several feet down. So the water levels were very, very high.
And then we get to the Bison Enclosure. This is, again, near the Lake Audie area, sort of south central part of the park. Right now, there's about 40 bison. You can see there's a few calves. Actually, I think I've got another picture there. It's not a great picture because it was zoomed in, but there are quite a few calves there. And these have been in the park since 1931. They originally brought the first herd in from Wainwright, Alberta. In the 1940s, though, there was some really bad outbreaks of bovine tuberculosis, so they lost quite a bit of the herd. They did do some replacements a few years later, and they brought in some bison from Elk Island National Park. And so they've got, it's quite a good size enclosure. I think it's about 500 hectares. And they've got sort of a summer grounds and a winter grounds in some places where they feed them and whatnot in tougher times. But it's a lovely opportunity to go and see them. You can drive fairly close to a number of the different habitats within the enclosure. So they say the best time to see them is dusk and dawn, but this was middle of the afternoon. So we were quite fortunate that day. I believe it was later the same day, we went out, just Chris and I, on a hike, and this is to Canosa, Lake. There's a little bit of a winding trail, and this is kind of at the highlight of the trail. This is a bridge that looks onto this wonderful little lake. And we've been out here a few times, and this canoe has always been here. And my understanding is it's a community canoe, so you're welcome to use it as long as you put it back and make sure it's not full of water and that sort of thing. So. Very quiet lake. This was one of the trails we did that had a fair number of mosquitoes. We didn't necessarily bring enough bug spray to get us there and back. I think we'd almost run out by the time we got to the lake, and it was only about 2 kilometers in. So we hustled on our way back. But out here on the lake, surprisingly, it was calm. There were no mosquitoes buzzing, anything like that. It's just a beautiful, calm lake and a nice length of a trail as well. Good for families. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, standing out on that dock was the only respite from the mosquitoes on that trail. It was the only place you could get away from them. So we spent quite a bit of time standing out there.
Okay. This is another photo I found from a postcard. This is the old highway, or what's known as the old highway, leading into the park. This would be if you're coming from north to south, so driving from Dauphin, Manitoba down to the park town site. It's an older road, and it's actually still there, but just in a different form. I do vaguely remember driving on it once or twice when I was young, so I think it was open through the early to mid 80s, and then it was shut down. It had become fairly overgrown, and it had been a few years since I'd been down it myself, but I wanted to take the kids down for a bike ride and was pleasantly surprised to see fresh asphalt poured like this in a bike path. So this takes you from the Lakeshore Walk, if you remember from the storm pictures, all the way down to the Wishing Well area. So a good little click. Lots of folks use it for biking and running and walking. And then this is on the way back again on that Lakeshore Trail there. So it's just a really nice, peaceful place to go. And this brings us to our next trip. We went down again, I think it was the August long weekend. And this picture here is taken at my sister's place in Manitoba. We were picking up my parents' old canoe. So this canoe is about 45 years old. It's sat for probably the last 20 years, just kind of in storage. And we wanted to make a go of it. So we picked it up and we put it in my vehicle, and we were going to just take it down. We were going to stay at the cottage this time. So we had some space to store it when we weren't using it. This is approaching Riding Mountain from the north side, so just outside of Dauphin. You can really see the actual outline of the hill structure there. The highest point, of course, over here. This is really quite steep. Later on in the pictures, we'll show you some of that landscape over there as well. But you really notice the difference between the boreal forest there and then the farmland in the front. Here's the cottage that we stayed at. We made great use of the sun porch. It was fantastic.
It was one of the cat's favorite places to be all day. If the door to the sunroom wasn't open, the cat would be there and absolutely mad at us.
Yeah. Another look at the downtown park. This is just off the main beach again. Here's the trellis in the middle. And this is the park administration building. The street is over here to the left, which you can't see. And again, some beautiful flower gardens. They employ a great staff. They always look terrific there. The dogs enjoyed coming down for walks. Again, it's quite accessible. Everything is paved. Here's a little peek at the marina. So this is the pier back here where that light was, and the red chairs are out here. And then there's usually a fair number of pontoon boats and small sailboat / yachts, I guess, if you could call them, moored in the marina at most of the times. And this was our first, or actually second time out with the canoe. This is at a small lake called Lake Catherine. And it's just a little outside the town site, a small lake. It's very calm. There's no motorized boating on this lake, so it's a great place to learn, which we needed to kind of refresh our skills. It had been some time since we'd been in a canoe, but Chris decided to take a vintage look with this picture here, and he added a bunch of filters, so we look like we're about the age of the canoe here.
It's a great place to go paddle boarding as well, because the main lake is often quite wavy, and sometimes even if it's an absolutely calm day, the main lake itself is still very wavy because of all the boats that are on there. So a lot of folks go to this area to go paddle boarding or canoeing for the first time, or even just with the kids to go swimming, because there are no motors here. So it's super quiet. There's a couple of fire pits that you can have picnics. Very popular place to go.
Yeah, Lake Catherine's also a lot warmer than Clear Lake. Clear Lake is a spring-fed lake, and it's quite deep. The Wishing Well actually is one of the springs that feeds into it, and I believe there's several underground springs as well. But Lake Catherine is not nearly as big. As you can see, you can kind of see all of it there in one picture. And even as a child, we used to drive out here as well to go swimming too. Back in the town site, there's a few of these wonderful topiaries with moss, and then they've got some succulents kind of plopped in there. This is a pair of bison. And this place, I always get nostalgic about, probably for different reasons than some other visitors. This is a picture of Dance Land not long after it was built, not to be confused with the Dance Land that's out at Manitou Lake. Totally different Dance Land. This is a very large structure. It's still more or less intact here. Was home to big bands back in the 40s, that sort of thing. It was built in the late 30s. And it was closed on and off for a while. You can rent it for weddings and things like that. However, when I was little, we used to be able to go roller skating in here. They used to strike up the PA system, and here's a couple pictures. We went to a craft show inside, so I was very excited to go back in here. It had been many, many, many years since I'd been in. This is kind of interest to me anyway. I saw these banners. They'd been there when I was young. And if I pause that there for a second, this is an old picture with the band shell. You can still see the banners were hanging back here in the 30s and 40s, so kind of neat. This is the ceiling, and again, when I was little, they used to light the neon, and I believe they do for weddings and whatnot, but it undulates with sort of neon blues and pinks and things. It's pretty far out. I love it. So this was just fantastic for me to come back and see again in all its glory and have it still looked after like this. I would be remiss to not mention the Park Theater. Now, this is an older picture. This wasn't taken last year because it was closed due to COVID-19. You may have heard of the Park Theater. It is a fantastic, fantastic building. There were several articles recently written about it being one of the most beautiful theaters in all of the world for its rustic reasons. I think, if I remember correctly, I got it written down here somewhere, it is the largest log cabin style theater in all of North America. So this is not a great picture. But that sort of shows you the interior. They have the original seats still. It has heritage status as well, and it was built in 36 and 37, another one of the relief projects. And they normally show films throughout the summer. This is a picture of what's then the museum and auditorium. It's now the visitor's center. And this year, they'd actually closed it down for some renovations. It hadn't been kind of updated, if you will, for at least 20 years. And they were doing extensive work to the outside, and they were also putting in new interpretation on the inside. There's a little bit of sort of natural history inside there. And it had been redone once, I believe, in the early 90s and had kind of deteriorated a little bit since that time. So it's underway right now. I can't remember if they had hoped to open it this year now or not, because the pandemic had, of course, thrown a wrench into their plans, but a beautiful building. A lot of the architecture you might notice looks kind of a cross between sort of Tudor and Scandinavian. Well, a lot of the settlers in the area were of Swedish and Norwegian descent, so they drew a lot on their building skills with the masonry and then the log work, of course. So a lot of the buildings in this park and other national parks actually have that same sort of look to them. This was one of our favorite places to go in the evening. Down again on that lakeshore walk along the main lake, down from the cottages. All of the streets are named after flowers in the cottage area, and each street has a corresponding dock down on the lake. So there's a dock every block. That rhymes. And we like to go down here in the evenings and just kind of sit and enjoy, watch the folks walk by and go by on the boats and whatnot.
It's one of the best places in the entire park to watch the sunset because the lake is right there and the sun literally sets on the lake, and it's a clear, unobstructed view. It's just absolutely the best.
And there's the pathway again. This was upgraded probably, oh golly, probably getting close to 30 years ago. It used to be paved and it was perpetually taken out in the spring every year by the flooding and the ice and whatnot. So they did a lot of remediation to the shoreline here, and they brought in all these big boulders, backfilled it, and then they just went with some crushed gravel here. And it's interesting because, as I mentioned, the lake is spring fed. Every now and then you'll see a little trickle of water that comes across, and it's just from the springs coming out of the side of the hill here. Lots of interesting boats, of course. This was a really neat little sailboat going by. Ah, this place, awesome. This is one of my favorite little hidden gems. It's not so hidden anymore because it's been found out, but this little cottage is on Deep Bay, which is still part of Clear Lake. And as the name suggests, it's one of the deepest parts of the whole lake. This is a former RCAF cottage. Deep Bay was also called Airplane Bay because many years ago, the RCAF used to help with some of the forest fire observations. So they would fly, they would check out the park, watch for danger spots, things like that. And this little cottage was actually used to house some of the pilots over the years. It kind of fell into disrepair. It was closed up for most of my childhood. I remember it being boarded up and there was graffiti on it. Didn't look very good. But I understand that back in the early 2000s, they had done some restoration to it. It's again a historic site. And now the park hosts an artist in residence program here at this wonderful little cottage. It's fairly private. As you can see, you kind of have to go down a little subpath, but it does sit right on the busier bay, which is right here. And on a typical summer day, this place is absolutely polluted with visitors. It's no longer that little secret place that only the locals know about. A lot of folks will pull their boats up to this area here, and there's kind of an overarching view of the bay on the lake. A number of steps going down. The cottage is over just out of camera shot over here, and then there's a little beach that runs all the way along this way here. But perfect time to go is in the evening. It's quite shady there, so even if it's a warm day, it's nice and cool, and generally it's not as busy then either.
Over to the left, just if you continue along the beach path, there's a little point that comes out, and you can actually walk out in the water, and it gets about waist deep, and then that's where it drops off. And we're not talking about 5-6 feet. We're talking dozens and dozens of feet straight off that ledge. And so what I like to do is I like to walk out in my sandals and my shorts, and I like to fish off that point because I'm right at one of the deepest parts of the bay. So I've pulled a couple of really big pike out of there just by walking into my waist. It's really cold at first, but eventually you do get used to the water temperature, and you can pull some nice fish out of there if you can handle the initial cold of that water.
There's also a little bit of folklore. I've not seen this myself. I've not seen photographs, but I have heard stories from folks who are keen on scuba diving. This lake is quite popular with scuba divers. That there is a traction engine, so think a steam-powered tractor, that had sunk through the ice in Deep Bay here, and it's actually a fairly popular space for people to go down and investigate. Now, I don't remember how deep it actually is. I know it is fairly deep, but I just feel that would be a very ominous thing to go down into the murky depths and then suddenly see this tractor, which has no right being at the bottom of a lake, suddenly emerging into sight. So more rain. On this trip, we met up with my sister again, and she has a niece the same age, or pardon me, she's a daughter the same age as my daughter, so my niece. And we took her out on this trail here, which is the Boreal Forest Trail, the Boreal Island Trail, pardon me. And it's got a really nice little interpretive sort of route that goes through the boreal forest. It tells a lot about the different plants that live there. There's some pieces of boardwalk, there's some bridges. Again, high bear activity quite often in this area. We saw a lot of droppings, but we didn't actually run into a bear. There's this little creek that kind of runs through and into a small lake. I think it's Tanner Lake, a little bit beyond the trail. It's quite a popular place to walk because it's not a super long trail. It's under 2 kilometers, I believe. So it's great for families with young children. And it's also fairly accessible for people with mobility challenges. So you could take a mobility chair down here if you wished. And again, lots of great plants to look at here with the raindrops on them. It kind of started to rain when we began the trail and we were like, oh gosh, should we turn back? And we just waited it out under some pine trees, and they sheltered us while the rain kind of did its thing, and then we were able to continue on. This trip was the first trip with the kids in the canoe as well. So we went back to Lake Catherine. My daughter has a little bit of a phobia about being on open water, so this was a good way to ease her into it. And back at the wishing well again. So a little bit later in the year, different flowers have come out in bloom. They have a mix of perennials and annuals here, and there's almost always a parks gardener working. I think almost every time we've been out here, there's been someone puttering along, weeding and planting and thinning and that sort of thing. This is a vintage picture, about the best one I could find of the wishing well. So if you remember back to where my sister and I were recreating our family picture, this is where we were sitting, about here. And then this is the actual wishing well, which is basically a wall with a little pond behind it. It's not actually a well as you would think of a typical wishing well shape. Some little fairy gardens that had been added, which were great to see. Something new every time, I think you notice. This is another area here. I believe you can kind of rent this little spot for weddings as well. They'll bring chairs out. And my kids with some of the carvings.
And if you're interested in wildlife at all, this is another good place to go and explore. There's frogs, and I've heard there's lizards in here and things like that too. Yeah. Salamanders. So it's a great little place to go exploring for wildlife like that, which even though I'm an adult now, I still like to go looking for the creepy, crawly, slimy things.
The other thing I maybe could mention quickly here, in the spring, when we were, golly, I was probably in my late teens, there were a few springs where the sucker fish would all come up because it's connected to the lake here, and they would spawn in the Wishing Well Creek. It was just the most bizarre thing. You'd see this wall of fish down below the bridges, and like, oh my gosh, what the heck's happening? And then talk to a few people, and they go, oh yeah, it happens some years. There's a big insurgence of them, and they take over the Wishing Well area. My kids and my niece wanted to go swimming in the worst possible way. And as you can see, the wind had come up. So they enjoyed just kind of going without their shoes and going out in the dock. The ends of them are buoyant, so they were floating quite a bit in these turbulent waves. But they had a lot of fun. They got soaking wet and quite chilly, but the cottage wasn't far away, so they could go back and warm up. And this brings us to our last trip of the year. This was in mid-September, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, but it was sort of just after the Labor Day weekend, am I right? Yep. Yeah. And there had been some frosts, so there was some nice colors happening. This is a trail that I'd mentioned earlier. This is still part of the Clear Lake Trail. However, this is on the south side. This leaves from near the marsh area, and it just connects to that larger trail system there. And that's looking at Clear Lake. This would be back where the town site is, kind of around this curve over here. So we had actually driven down to what's called the Boat Cove and parked there and then walked this distance. Clear Lake is to the right here. And then on the left, this is South Lake, which is a very shallow, marshy lake. It's quite large as well, not as big as Clear Lake. And then there's this little sand spit that kind of goes in between. It's a really unique area. Some years it's quite washed out. I know I've tried to bike this the odd time in my youth and come to great big gaps and had to actually go down into the lake with my shoes off and walk my bike across. But this year it was fairly intact, and that just has to do with how the weather was the previous year and where the sand gets pushed. Clear Lake has a wonderful, diverse species of trees in the area. Birch are my favorite. So there's a picture of a big, beautiful birch tree.
This was a really, really nice trail for me because I got to see so many different aspects of the park. Having not gone here before I met Karla, this was another trail where you really got to experience what the park was all about. The different vegetation, the wildlife again, the different lakes and how they're connected. So It is a really good trail. Most of it is fairly flat and easy to traverse, but there are a couple of areas that are somewhat steep. But I would suggest just go until you can't go anymore and then turn back around and you'll be just fine. It's a lovely trail to go.
It is indeed. And I think you can go the farthest on the south side. It's the north side that's more broken up by things that have happened to the trail over the years. So lots of ferns along the way. Our destination for this trip was just to walk as far as the church camps. There's a handful of them on the South Shore. I believe this one is Camp Wanna Come Back, and or pardon me, no, it doesn't matter. This was one of the first ones we came to coming from east to west, and then they continue on further to the west there. And this was just a neat sign that kind of showed different directions. And that's South Lake again. There's a few different trails that connect to the main Clear Lake Trail. This one takes you back actually to the right to the Ominik Boardwalk area. Many of these are also accessible for snowshoes and cross-country skiing in the wintertime, which is wonderful. Back down at the lake here, we decided to try some of this strange blue wine, which is actually pretty tasty. This is a morning photo, and it was quite dewy, but the leaves sitting on top of the staircase here were quite photogenic. So I stopped and I took a picture before we went down. Also tried not to slip because they were a little slick.
I was just going to say very treacherous too, because I almost tumbled down the stairs.
Yeah. So we decided to walk down to the town site via the Lakeshore Path. And then as you get closer to town, it actually comes right close to the water here. This part is paved. Most of the trail is gravel, but this part is paved here as you approach the town site. Back into the town, you see the lovely elms here again. There's the trellis, and you can see the leaves are starting to change. There's some red ones and yellow ones, and still a few green ones here. In the foreground, you'll see some clumps there. Those are all daylilies, and they've been there for many years as well. Looking from the inside down to the beach. And this is one of my favorite spots, just in the park area there. To the left, where you see the construction fence over here, this is the visitor center, just off camera here, that's being reconstructed. This is the bandstand. I've got another picture of that coming up here in a moment. The main beach is over here to the right off camera. Behind it here, there's mini golf and there's tennis courts. And then further down the path down here goes to a playground past tennis courts. And then what's often referred to as the old campground. It was originally sort of temporary camping. My parents actually both camped there when they were children. And then over time, permanent structures started to appear, and it's now full of small cabins and tiny homes. So it's kind of a neat contrast between the established cottage area, which is actually more like houses as we know them, back to this more, I don't want to say ramshackle, they're quaint, I guess would be a better way to describe them. They're very adorable, and they're just a little closer together back there.
If you want to go and explore that old campground part of the park, I would suggest that you do it on foot. I often have problems navigating some of the streets in my big F-150, and I often have to back out of some of the laneways and things like that. But if you go on foot, you'll enjoy it a lot more than if you're trying to navigate through with a vehicle.
Here's a better picture of the bandstand. And again, another relief project built in the 30s. And we've seen many concerts here over the years. There's been children's activities. A few years ago, Chris and I saw Trooper. Now, they weren't set up in the bandstand. They had a modern stage in front of it, but it's kind of in the front of a big open meadow. And it's always been a really great gathering place. Parks Canada usually puts on these free concerts throughout the summer, or they had in the past. And it's always been a wonderful place to gather. And I found one old picture here as well. This is inside the trellis looking through to the bandstand in the 30s. This is looking from the pier back towards, this would be the tennis courts back here behind the trees, and looking west. The red chairs again, with the willows starting to change. Just some lovely colors coming through. Here's the pier as it looks today. This was remodeled, I believe, in 2001. Before it looked like this, however, it was quite a bit different. It was all earth with the exception of one little gap here to let the water flow through. And Clear Lake, if you're not familiar with it, it's sometimes subject to having what's known as the itch, which is a parasite carried by ducks. And because the water was quite stagnant, the main beach is just to the right side of this pier. Swimmer's itch was very prevalent, especially when I was a child before the renovation was done. So this was one of the things that they did to try to fix that problem, allow for better water flow, so that if there is a bad itch here, as they say, the water can move a bit further and faster and get through without causing so much of an irritation. There are showers on the main beach as well to help get that off of you, and that's basically what you need to do. They recommend putting sunscreen on before you go in to act as a barrier, and then as soon as you come out, you have a shower and towel off quickly. And I've had it. It's not fun, but it's also not the end of the world if you do get it.
I don't think we've had a problem with it in recent years. I've been in the lake, I think, every year that we've gone, and I don't do the sunscreen thing. I usually just towel off as soon as I get out of the water, but I've never had a problem with it. And that's been, what, 5-6 years now?
I think so, yeah.
I, not having known it before, I would suggest the renovations they did absolutely worked as intended.
For sure. This is from the end of the pier looking back towards the main land area. The Martise is a very large boat, as you can see, and this is available for tours. They do daytime tours, sunset tours, and there's actually a dinner cruise you can take on that goes around, I think it's a good half of the lake, with some narration from the staff to tell you a little bit about the park's history and things like this. So I've not done this one yet. There used to be a pontoon boat years ago that used to do a sunset tour. I imagine it's probably a very similar script, but it's a good way to experience the park with some interpretation to tell you a bit more about things. This is the back side of the visitor center. Again, you can see the renovation going on there. Normally there's a little fountain just kind of tucked in this area. I'm curious to see if it will still be intact because it was original to the building. And then this is just part, again, the English gardens that go around the yard space here. So I'm very excited. Hopefully I can get back soon and see what they've done this year and see what they've changed or what stayed the same. Another one of the topiaries. This one's at the south end of the town site with the moose. And here is the former fire hall. Now I looked this up as well. You can guess from the architecture, it's one of those relief projects again. It was built in 1935, 1936. There's a picture of it. I even found one with a fire truck, which was pretty neat. This always fascinated me as a child. I came from a small town with a fairly modern fire station, and I was just enthralled when my dad told me the tower was to help dry the hoses, which I know is a common thing with older firehouses, but it was the first one I'd really seen up close and been familiar with. So that always intrigued me. Nowadays, the fire hall is actually used as the Anishinaabe Sharing Lodge. So they have local people from the indigenous communities, and they come and they share stories. We attended one as a family a number of years back, and it was just wonderful. They had, I think the one we took was medicinal plants. Was that the one, Chris?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so it was quite neat. It's nice to see the older building. They actually don't use it as a fire hall anymore at all. The village of Onanol services the area, and Erickson just to the south. So it's good to see that building being reused.
In my youth, I used to teach outdoor survival, winter survival, and things like that. And so the use of plants in potentially first aid or in medicine, or if you're stranded for food and things like that, intrigues me. And so one of my favorite things to do, whether I'm at Clear Lake or at Prince Albert, is walk through the forest with my foraging book and try and see how many of the plants I can identify. So that sharing lodge, and to be able to sit in on some of the indigenous stories about the plants in the area, was something really important to me, to be able to just see what the locals who had been there for generations are using compared to what the book is saying, and how many of them are on par with each other.
Awesome. So after all the warnings all summer, being on the lookout for bears, which we hadn't seen, we finally saw a bear on one of the last days of our trip of the year. So this was just off of the highway, kind of near the Wishing Well, near Lake Catherine. Black bears are quite predominant in the park. I looked up the stats because I was curious. I'd always heard there was a higher than average population. They say they have between 800 to 1,000 bears in the park. One anecdotal story that I'm aware of is that the bears in Riding Mountain often have triplets or even quadruple cubs. So they have very big families in this park. I believe one of the record holders for one of the largest black bears in the world was actually from Riding Mountain. So it's a great place to go for bear watching. Just hopefully you'll have better luck than we did. This is the last remaining gate in Riding Mountain. There were originally 3. This is the east gate, so this is down towards the far edge of the park. If you're familiar with the area at all, this is near McCreary, Manitoba, and it was actually being refurbished. So it normally has a darker stain to it, and it usually says you can kind of see the ghost letters there, Riding Mountain National Park up above. It's been being restained and relettered. This is also a heritage site. This was, again, a relief project in the early 30s. As I mentioned, the last remaining one, there's part of one of the turrets at one of the little museums inside the park area. This is even quite tall. It's kind of hard to get a perspective on it, but you can walk right up to one of the ones that's being preserved in the museum there. And then here is a vintage picture again, not long probably after it was built. Just behind you can see a little cottage. This is the Whirlpool Lake Warden's Cottage. And what you can't see over here to the left side would be the gatekeeper's cottage. So the person who was the staff member working in the gate would actually have their own home. It's fairly remote from the rest of the park, and you're probably closer to the villages and towns outside from this point, actually. So this is a small trail called Burls and Bittersweet. It's, again, a great family trail. We didn't have the kids with us on this trip, but I had not done this one for a long time, and Chris had never done this trail. And it basically meanders around a little creek. And again, the colors were fantastic. You couldn't take a bad picture that day. The neat thing about the east end of this park is the oak trees, which are down there. We don't see a lot of those out here in Saskatchewan, and even most parts of Manitoba, unless you get really down south there. This is wonderful to always see a forest of oak trees, to me anyway. So the trail is named Burls and Bittersweet. This is a bittersweet vine. Many of them had already lost their leaves, so I kind of took a picture. This is the best example that I could find. And it basically just climbs up whatever it's nearby. Just a really gnarly tree trunk here, another oak. There's also a fair number of green ash down this side of the park, whereas the rest of the park is more coniferous, different pines and spruces, as well as birch trees and poplars. So this end is really quite mixed with things that aren't represented in the rest of the park. There's a couple little suspension bridges here. Chris is experimenting. I'm not a fan of them, even though they're not very high. And then here's some of the burls. So these are the little growths on the trees that you see here. And while you see them in nature, you know, a fairly regular basis, they're very concentrated down here. And I'm not exactly sure the reasoning for that, but they are down there a lot. Another neat thing about the east end of this trail is the shale. The east end of the park has a lot of it. There's several trails where you can see major outcroppings of it. We did one a few years ago called Gorge Creek, and you actually walk down a shale cliff. It's pretty cool. But this is just on the creek side. And this is from a lookout point about halfway back up to the main part of the park. So you can see for sure you're on the edge of an escarpment. The prairie kind of disappears down there. This is looking sort of northeast from Riding Mountain. It was a beautiful day. We were very fortunate it didn't rain on us. The clouds kind of looked threatening in the back, but we got back home high and dry. On the way back, we also stopped in at Whirlpool Lake, which is another no motorized boat place you can go to. There's another little bridge here that goes over the creek that spills out of the lake. You can camp here. It's just tenting and it's walk-in sites. Another nice, really peaceful place to kind of get away and unplug. We didn't canoe here yet, but it might be on the list for next time. One of the last things we did, we actually stopped in this little area, and if you've got a keen eye, you might see there's a memorial stone over here. This is what's called the Deer Road Cemetery. I've maybe mentioned this at other presentations, but my family is a funeral family, and I'm the 4th generation of my family to have worked in a funeral home. I remember when I was a young child coming here with my dad. It was important for him to come here. He had come as a child as well, to pay respect to a family that had lost a number of children in a house fire. And looking around this area, I hadn't been back for a long time. We couldn't find any sign of it. So, you know, what the heck? We'll flip ahead here. Here's that one stone that you can see from that distant picture. I believe there was one other military memorial, a flat one, but everything else had been moved to the edges. So there was a number of crosses piled up on the sides here. Just, I believe, probably for maintenance over the years, they deteriorated. I've got a friend who works in the memorial stone business who, like me, has an interest in cemeteries and histories, and she did some research and digging and found some information, and that's basically what had happened for maintenance purposes. They had tidied up the cemetery. The records were a little patchy, but I'd asked her to help me put the pieces together from this story. My dad's passed on himself, and I couldn't ask him for more details. She did some digging and found that in 1928, a family who had lived not far outside the park had actually lost, I think it was 5 children in a house fire. Parents had gone to town and they had trouble with an incubator, I believe, and it had actually caught the house on fire, and they returned home. The dad tried to pull the children out of the fire. He was burned terribly. And I think they only had a couple of the children that had come with them on their trip that survived. So very tragic story. And she's going to be looking into adding some of these stories to that Find a Grave website, so that at least it's recorded in one place instead of a scavenger hunt, if you will, of clues and whatnot. So I was glad to go back here. This is just outside the park and it's not marked well. We even had trouble finding the name of the cemetery. But some of the early settlers from just outside the park area are buried here. So hopefully one day there'll be maybe some better memorialization or a plaque or something that could maybe tell some of their stories a bit better. But this was our very last evening. Again, you can see those clouds are rolling through, very unsettled. We decided to risk it and eat outside at the lake house. And here we are. We had some very delicious burgers and some Winnipeg beers. And it was the end to a fantastic trip there. So that's the end of that.
So we don't have a lot of time left for the presentation today. I apologize, I had to turn my camera off as I am sucking the internet here and it was starting to go glitchy on me. So nobody wants to stare at my face anyhow. So are there any quick questions that we can help you with? And of course, if you do have something, toss it in the chat, or if you're brave enough, please crack your mic and ask the question. You can find Wandering Whimsy, which is our photography blog page, on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. So if you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to shoot us a message through any one of those platforms, and we can try and help you out. If you're looking to plan a trip to any of the locations that we've done a presentation on in the past, whether it's Riding Mountain, Clear Lake, Banff, San Francisco, Vegas, any of those things, if you have questions, we love to help so that you can enjoy your trip. Sue, did you have a question? It looked like you were getting ready to ask something.
Yeah, this is Terry.
Hi, Terry.
Kind of curious about the real estate inside the park. Like these cottages, like how far apart are they from one another? Or like,
well,
you know,
it depends on what section you're in, but they are fairly healthy in terms of the amount of land that you get for the cottages. That said, plan to dig deep in order to afford one of them because they are crazy expensive.
Yeah, I get that part.
Yeah. It's so close to Winnipeg that all of the folks from Winnipeg with the deep pockets there are gobbling up a cottage when it becomes available. And unfortunately, if it's one of the vintage cottages that are there, it's either getting bulldozed or it's being renovated to the point where you can't recognize it as one of the original cottages anymore. For at least myself, and I know Karla shares the feelings with me, we like those vintage park type cottages because they speak to the history. But you do get a pretty good piece of land there. Yeah, at least in my opinion. They're not tight like they are maybe here in Saskatchewan. I know we had so much room at the cottage there. The dogs were running free and just loved it.
Yeah. Okay. That's what it looked like. Lots of room.
Lots of room. There, at least before we left last summer, there were several for sale. So if you're interested, you might be able to hop on, I think it's Remax or Century 21 that were the most popular out there. But you can take a look at some of the lot sizes because I was surprised too.
Okay.
Thanks. Lovely photography. Just wonderful photography.
Much.
Just excellent. It's good to see all the different seasons too. I'll have to get there. You piqued my interest. That and Yellowstone Park are now on my list.
We would absolutely recommend the trip to Riding Mountain just because it's so close and there's so many different types of geography there, so many different trails. You could probably, and this is me safely saying it, probably do 3 trails a day and not get bored. You'd need more than one summer for sure to get to do all the trails.